Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. We've been walking through our Journey to Faith series now. This is the 32nd week that we've been doing so. We're following the genealogy of Jesus, which you find in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. Tonight we move on to Jesse, the father of King David. So we're in a time of the Bible now which is becoming more familiar to many. We're in the period of the time of Judges, and part of the teaching is stitching together the different books of the Bible in order that you can have context and understanding around this time of the Bible, which is often not read so much, or perhaps a little bit difficult to understand, or for purposes of dating. So tonight we're going to be focusing predominantly from the book of Judges, in the second half of the book of Judges, from Judges 10 onwards, and we're also going to be delving into the first 7 chapters of the book of 1 Samuel, and this is that understanding that these periods of time, they actually overlap one another in the Bible. We may read them as separate books, but we understand when we join what's been the events that are occurring at the time, and we realise that these things are happening simultaneously. So as we go through the teaching, we'll continue to stitch this together to give you understanding. Tonight's pictures, we have some maps for you, because there's a lot going on in the land of Israel, different locations, and judges who come from different places, and adversaries who come from different areas around the land of Israel. And so we'll put those up for you to help your understanding. This lesson, as all lessons, will be going through a post-production process and will be posted onto the Jesus Movement YouTube channel. And can I encourage you, if you enjoy the teaching and you want to share it with others, if you want to hit your share button on your Facebook now, that would be much appreciated. The Jesus Movement's here to teach and share the word of the Lord, and its purpose is actually to reach out around the world, to reach as many people as possible. So if you could join me in sharing, that would be wonderful. Okay, so we'll get underway. So last week, as said, we looked at the life journey of Obed, who was the son of Boaz, and Obed is the father of Jesse, who of course becomes the father of King David, just to put a bit of context in these names for you. Jesse's name is also known as Eshai or Yishai. In Hebrew it's spelled Y-I-S-H-A-I. And the words actually mean God exists, or God's gift. And you can imagine at this point in time, he was named Jesse, then it was very important, because during the time of Judges, his people kept leaving him, kept abandoning him, kept worshipping foreign gods. And so when Jesse was born as part of the genealogy of Jesus, we see him as a forefather of Jesus, and so his role became really significant as the father of King David. And so he was there to declare that in fact God did exist during these tumultuous times, where in the Bible we keep learning that God's people keep abandoning him and worshipping foreign gods. He is a gift as well. Obviously his contribution is part of the genealogy of Jesus as a forefather, but significantly he becomes the father of King David, who unites Israel for the first time since they took over the land of Canaan. So Jesse's role is very important. So of course Jesse is from the tribe of Judah. He is known in the Bible, if you read the scripture, as an Ephrathite. I talked about it before. That's an area attached to Bethlehem, and he's born during a time of peace during the reign of Judges. So his birth is also recorded in the book of Ruth under the genealogy of David, which you'll find in Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 to 22. You will also find it, so specifically verse 22 reads, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. So Jesse inherited his forefather's land. So he had a field to grow grain, he had a vineyard to grow grapes, he had a grove of olive trees and grazing land for his herds and his flocks. He does not live on the land though, for he lives in his father's house in the town of Bethlehem, protected by a wall and a gate against the many raiders that were coming at this point in time. With the short exception of Gideon's son, Abimelech, who we spoke about last week, crowning himself king for 3 years, and although many of the Israelites had turned from the Lord to worship the gods of foreign nations, Israel had been led by its own judges who upheld the laws of God for 85 years now. It was during the latter time of Jair from Gilead that Jesse was born. So he was the last judge that I spoke about last week. So again from Gilead, so he's on the Jordanian side of the Jordan River today. Now when Jesse was being weaned at the age of 3, Jair of Gilead, the Bible tells us, was gathered to his people, which of course means that he passed away. And news of his death spread quickly throughout Israel, but God did not lift up a new leader, for the people had continued to turn away from the Lord. So we read in the Bible that when some of the leaders passed away, that God didn't always replace them straight away. There was a time when they turned away from him where God would actually not replace them with a new leader, and so they would go back into a period of turmoil. Excuse me. So in Judges chapter 10 verses 6 to 8, it reads, "Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord." Excuse me. Just going to have a quick drink. Again, Judges chapter 10 verses 6 to 8. "Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths and the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, he became angry with them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them." So you can see from that description there from Judges how they were serving more than I'm sorry, I have time with my voice here. They had more than one God they were contending with, and they had more than one nation that was surrounding them as well. So what I'm going to do to put some context in this is I'm going to put up a map for you to have a look. So basically on this map here, there's these locations. So up at the top of the land of Israel is the Sidonians. A little bit across from there is Damascus in Aram, which is today's Syria. Down the bottom here we've got the Ammonites in today's Jordan. We've got the Moabites also in today's Jordan, further down the bottom of the Dead Sea. And of course we've got the Philistines who are on the coast and where today's Gaza is. So when you look at this map, you'll see that the state or the nation of Israel is actually surrounded by people who are actually worshipping foreign gods. And so this influence was a problem. So what would happen is that these people would come in to their land and they would invade them, but also their people would intermingle and they would become a burden to those who lived there. So I'll just pass that around and just hold it up to the Facebook first. Sebastian, so just have a quick look at that, and you can see the pictures there, which highlights all of those locations surrounding the land. I hope that helps. So again, these will be posted on YouTube. So we can see, as mentioned, all encircling the land of Canaan were these people. So the king of Ammon had a grudge against the Israelites, and he was of the opinion, and it says in Judges 11:13, "When Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan." So these are the river systems. So the rivers, the two tributaries that feed into the Jordan River and the Jordan River itself on the Jordanian side. This, of course, however, was not true, for the Amorites had taken the land from the Ammonites long before the arrival of the Israelites. When the Israelites arrived and requested safe passage through their land, the king at the time, King Sihon, so we covered this in an earlier lesson, refused them in the ensuing battle. King Sihon and the Amorites fought and lost against the Israelites, and the land came into their hands. The king of Ammon asked for the land he perceived to be his to be given back peacefully, but the Israelites were not going to give it to them, for they believed, and it says in Judges chapter 11 verse 24, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. And so you might remember when before the Israelites went into the land of Canaan at the time, they had to fight against two kings on the Jordanian side, and one was King Og further north, and this other king, which we're talking about now, King Sihon, further to the south. So he's in the northern part of the Dead Sea on the Jordanian side, and so this is who they're talking about. So this land was never theirs, and yet this king's laying claim to it against the Israelites. The Israelite occupation of Canaan no longer resembled a unified nation at this time either, nor one that worshipped God. The different tribes and their territories became influenced by numerous nations around them and began to worship numerous gods. The Ammonites attacked and oppressed, and in Judges 10 verses 8 it says the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead, claiming the land was theirs, they made the Gileadites suffer for 18 years. So we learn here that the people who were on the western side of the Jordan River, who lived around Gilead, known as the Gileadites, they were actually to suffer for 18 years under the adversity of the Ammonites who were on the same side of the river. And so from this description in the Bible, I know it's a lot of detail, but what we find out is that certain parts of the land are being attacked whilst other parts aren't. So some people are living under oppression in some regions where others are still not living under oppression. And so it goes through this period of Judges. So Jesse grew up in these times, and they were violent times. And like all of his forefathers before him, ever since his people had entered the land of Canaan and claimed it for their own, he suffered not just under the oppression of a foreign ruler, but from an angry God. For 18 years, the people of Bethlehem were raided by the Philistine neighbours who would come up through the Shephelah Valley from the coastal plains where they lived. They were under great distress. So you may remember the scripture I read a little bit earlier. It listed all of the foreign powers around them with the foreign gods, but it actually said very clearly that the Philistines and the Ammonites would be coming in and attacking them. So the Philistines are on the coast, and so they're to the to the west, and the Ammonites are on the other side of the Jordan River, and so they're to the east. So the people who are living in Bethlehem, the Bible tells us that these enemies were coming at them from both sides. The Philistines were the closest to them because the Dead Sea was between them and the Ammonites. And so the Philistines used to do these raids where they come up from the coastal plains up into the hill country, and they would attack them. In Judges 10 verse 9 it says the Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah, Benjamin and the house of Ephraim, and Israel was in great distress. So we learn here, when I was talking about how they're attacking in regions, Judah is in the south, the lower part of the new land of Israel. Benjamin sits on top of the tribe of Judah, which is on that map. So they're a small tribe just on the top of Jerusalem today. And then Ephraim is the next one above them again. And so it tells us the Ammonites crossed the Jordan to fight against these three particular tribes. So the armies of the Ammonites, having oppressed the Israelites in Gilead for 18 years, decided to subdue the Israelites who lived on the opposite side of the Jordan River in the territories of Judah, Benjamin and Ephraim. They crossed the fords of the Jordan River, which is next to Jericho, at the top of the Dead Sea, and made their way up into the hill country. In 1137 BC, it got worse when the army of the Ammonites marched down what's known as the Way to Shur, which way means highway, into his little town of Bethlehem. So when you have a look at the map of Israel, the way to Shur is the highway that runs from north to south across the top of the hill country. So the men, however, they had no means with which to defend themselves. They were unprepared to resist such an onslaught. The few men who tried to resist were put to the sword, so the remaining townsfolk submitted themselves to the authority of their attackers as they sought to preserve their lives. In Judges 10 verse 7, the Lord says that he had sold them into the hands of both the Philistines and the Ammonites. So you can see here that these people were in for a beating, because it wasn't just a case of an influence of foreign powers, but the Lord had actually given them into their hands. And so they were being punished in these circumstances. So they were shattered and they were crushed. At this time, from Jesse's birthday, he would have been approximately 20 years old at this point in time, and so he would have come of age, as we say, as a man, and so he would have been able to go to war. He would have been able to fight for Israel. However, the problem is, like most people at the time, he had no weapons, he had no training, and there was no army to go to. They just had these people coming and attacking them. So in great distress, Jesse would have joined the chorus of Israelites who cried out as a nation and petitioned to the Lord. And in Judges 10:10 it says that they said, "We have sinned against you, forsaking our God and serving the Baals." But the Lord was so angry, he replied to them in verse 14, "Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you are in trouble." The Israelites had been oppressed for such a lengthy period of time, though, that they didn't give up. Again, they acknowledged their sin and petitioned the Lord. And in verse 15 they said, "We have sinned. Do with us whatever you think best, but please rescue us now." And so we see here that God says to his people that if you want to go and worship and follow a foreign god, and they're so powerful, then off you go, see how you go. And of course the result was nothing. And so for us today, there's a message for us to take from this as well, is that if we want to serve something or someone else other than God, then expect to suffer the consequences of those actions. God is not going to rescue you if you're not even going to acknowledge who he is in your life. And so we need to realise that whilst we're reading these old stories from the Bible, that the truth of the matter is that today we seek many other things, and oftentimes only when we're oppressed or distressed or depressed do we actually seek the Lord. And so the lesson in this is that we must seek the Lord first in all things we do, as the scriptures tell us, and when we don't, there is dire consequence, as we find out through this story. So as a sign of their humility and futility, they went out, and the Bible tells us they removed the foreign gods from amongst themselves and once again served the Lord. Even those who didn't worship foreign gods had allowed those who did to dwell amongst them. And so there's another message for us. Sometimes there's things going on around us and we just turn the blind eye and we say, it's okay, well I'm not doing it, so we don't have to worry about it. And yet we find here that when the circumstances were so bad, not only did they clean up their own backyard, but they decided to clean up the backyard of those who were around them. And they obviously finally acknowledged that there's these foreign gods dwelling amongst them. So at this point, God couldn't bear to watch his people suffer anymore, so he stirred his people to come together to overcome their oppressors. So oppressed on two different fronts, as I've mentioned, by the Ammonites and the Philistines, reflects how the nation of Israel was now just a loose tribal organisation of virtual monarchical city-states. So we mentioned this before when they first entered the land of Canaan. We looked at what a city-state was, and a city-state is basically a city that has its surrounding fortress walls and its population within. It'll usually have an armed force of some number, and then outside of that they'll have a regional area where they're farming and grazing their livestock. And so that's the sum total of their kingdom. And so what's happened to the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Issachar, and the tribe of Zebulun, and the tribe of Ephraim, and so on, is they become fragmented. So rather than functioning as a tribe of Israel, a united people, they've now become separated into smaller bodies. And of course this makes it easier for the foreign raiders to come in and have power over them. And so this is the circumstance that's happening as we learn that the Philistines and the Ammonites don't take on the whole nation of Israel, they only attack certain areas. And we also learn that they don't get defended against by the whole nation of Israel, only the tribes who are actually being attacked. So we find here that we've got a mirror of what Canaan had been like when the Israelites had first subdued the land. No longer acting as a confederation of tribes unified under the God of Israel, only served to weaken them further. This led to a situation where the tribes of Israel did not come together to fight their oppressors as a common enemy, but rather the regions that were most affected sought to stand on their own. The Ammonites had been called to arms once again and come together to camp in Gilead, just on the other side of the Jordan River. But after raiding the Israelites for 18 years with no opposition, this time was different. The Israelites from the people of Gilead assembled together and camped at a place called Mizpah. There was none amongst them, however, who would lead their people, so they came together and agreed that whoever stepped forward to launch an attack against their oppressors would be lifted up and made, as it says in Judges chapter 11, verse 18, head of all those living in Gilead. But still not one amongst their number would step forward. So the leaders from the region of Gilead went out and they sought a mighty warrior called Jephthah. That's spelled Jephthah. So again, Jephthah. He did not live with them, for although his father Gilead had given birth to his brothers, his mother was not the same, for she was a prostitute. His brothers had driven him away to ensure he received none of the family's inheritance. So again we see the laws that were given in play here. They sought him out where he had been living in the land of Tob. It took some convincing, but after promising Jephthah that he would be made herd and commander over them, the elders of Gilead returned with him to Mizpah, where he took control. So I've got another map here, and again these will all be posted on YouTube. We'll hold this up for the camera in a moment. But basically we've got this 3D picture of the land of Israel here, and Gilead is this region on this part of the map below the Sea of Galilee, along on the Jordanian side of the Jordan River and north of the Dead Sea. And so we find that all of the action that's happening is in this region, and all of these towns are actually listed on the map to show. So there's quite a few of them. So what I'll do is I'll get this to be held up for the camera at Facebook, so you can have a bit of a look at these. So just have a look at that. You'll see all of the different coloured lines. So these are the different people who are coming together to fight one another, and you can see it all coalesces in that region on the side of the Jordan River there. So I'll keep speaking as you have a look at that. So sending messengers to the king of Ammon to ask why he was attacking them, Jephthah learnt that the king believed the land was his, even though the Amorites had taken it from them prior to the arrival of the Israelites. Jephthah sent his messengers back again to explain how the land was given to them by God when they had beaten the Amorites under King Sihon and King Og many years ago. But although the Amorites had beaten the Ammonites long before the arrival of the Israelites, hard isn't it? Lots of ites here. The king didn't accept this. Jephthah sought peace first, but this was to no avail. And in Judges 11 verses 29, it says, so the Spirit of the Lord, so we're talking about the Holy Spirit, came upon him, and passing through Mizpah, he crossed Gilead and Manasseh to confront the Ammonites. Called upon by his people rather than by the Lord, Jephthah foolishly made a sacrificial vow to the Lord if he would guarantee him a victory. Of course this wasn't necessary, for this offer of a sacrifice to assure a victory was a practice of foreign nations who worshipped foreign gods. So here he is making a vow to make a sacrifice, and he's actually got the Lord behind him. And so this is a foolishness which is going to have a consequence. This lack of faith actually ended up costing him the life of his only child. And if you read in Judges 11 verses 31 to 40, it tells you the details of that particular story. For when he overcame the Ammonites and went on to devastate 20 towns from a place called Aroer to Abel Keramim, he came home and fulfilled his vow, and he sacrificed his daughter as a burnt offering. That's in Judges 11 verse 31. So we find this is really horrific. We have a man who stood up for God's people in battle, and he made a vow to sacrifice his own child, and because he won the victory, the consequence was he actually burnt his own daughter to death. And so this is a horrific story of the Bible, but it also tells you how when someone makes a vow, certainly in the past, perhaps not so much today, a vow was a man's word, and if you made a vow, you did what you said and you honoured it. And so this man would have had victory anyway if God was on his side, but foolishly he resorted to what he'd learnt from those around him, the very people with the very gods he's fighting against. He actually did what he was fighting against and ended up losing his daughter because he did so. And so it's a very tragic story of the Bible. Again, sorry for all the town names. These pictures will go up so you can examine them in detail. So the men from Ephraim heard of his victory and called their men together to form an army. So Ephraim, the tribe, is of course on the side of today's Israel, about halfway up the land. Travelling across the Jordan River to a place called Zaphon, they confronted Jephthah and the Gileadites. Asking Jephthah why he had not called the men, he answered that he had, but they had not come to his aid. So this gives the evidence that the Israelites were living like separate monarchic states, like I mentioned, because they weren't paying attention to one another. This man went to fight, he sent word to another tribe, come and help us. They didn't come. He won. Suddenly they come across and they say, why didn't you call us? We would have helped you. And he said, well, I did, but you didn't come. So I imagine if he hadn't won the battle, these people wouldn't have gone and wouldn't have stood beside him. So a bit of a testimony to him and that character. So the Ephraimites had come to fight, and they said in Judges 12:1, we're going to burn your house over your head. A battle ensued, but the Lord was with the Gileadites, and they won a great victory over them. This battle was so large that 40,000 Ephraimites were killed, which it mentions in Judges 12, verses 4 to 6. So if you understand what's going on, we have the Ephraimites, which is a tribe of Israel, fighting against the Gileadites, which are a sub-tribe from the tribe of Gad. They border both Gad and Manasseh, depending what part they're in. And they're actually fighting against one another. So God's people are actually killing each other now. And so we read here that the numbers were so great that 40,000 Ephraimites were killed. And so they've got all these adversaries coming against them from outside, and here they are killing each other. And so we see in the book of Judges that everything's gone out the window. It's just man against man, dog eat dog. They're no longer standing together as the tribe of Israel. They're no longer looking out for each other. They're actually warring against each other. And so you can see why this period of time in the book of Judges is described as a bit of an abomination, because it's very violent, because we just find people constantly killing in order to take control of others. So this was the largest number of Israelites killed in a battle to date during the period of Judges. Sadly, it's between their own tribes, so it's a very strange situation. So this was the first instance also in the Bible where the Israelites went to battle against their own people. So from the time that Abraham first walked in the land of Canaan, and all of the story that goes all the way through to his family, his sons, down to Egypt, through the Sinai Peninsula, the desert, back up into the land of Canaan to form what should be the nation of Israel, we find that this is the first time where they actually fought against one another. So whilst Jephthah asserted his authority over Israel by force, he was no longer the only commander of Gilead's army. He went on to lead Israel, but the land of Israel did not have rest, and the period of his leadership is much shorter than any of the other judges before him. Israel was led by Jephthah the Gileadite for only 6 years until he died in 1132 BC. So what happens now is we revert back to the story of Jesse. Remember further south that Jesse was in Bethlehem and they had the Philistines coming up the escarpment and raiding them constantly, as well as the Ammonites from the other side. And so this is that point what I'm saying, where there's multiple things going on in the Bible here, and so it makes it a little bit hard to keep on top of it. So Jesse, amongst his other people, have been praying, and their prayers of petition were answered, but he never did get to fight. Messengers came through Bethlehem and spoke of this great victory I've just explained over the Ammonites. So they were going to go and fight, but because of this tribal fight, they never ended up going. But when Jesse learned that 42,000 Ephraimite men had died in conflict with those from Gilead, he would have been shocked, as most of his other people would have been, or should have been. Like his forefathers before him, Jesse worked hard to restore his farm, his vineyard, his olive grove, and the numbers in his herds and flocks out in the pasture lands. He would have employed those without land to work for him, and his little town of Bethlehem, while still under threat of raids from the Philistines, grew in number and grew in prosperity again. And again, this is because the Ammonites had been overcome. There was one less enemy coming at them. The townsfolk were blessed for their faithfulness and obedience to the God of Israel. The promise of God's covenant ensured the protection of Jesse and Bethlehem, for Jesse will father a son who will become a king. 6 years passed under Jephthah's leadership until in Jesse's 25th year, God lifted up the first judge of Israel from Bethlehem. And so we find, and we're going to show you a map with all the locations a bit later, that judges were raised up in all different parts of Israel. And in this particular part of the story, we have to remember throughout this whole series of events that Jesse and those who come before him and those who come after them are all part of the genealogy of Jesus, which means that they're all forefathers of Jesus. So God's hand must have been on those people to ensure the fulfillment of the prophecy that his son would come and die on the cross. And so we have to understand this through all these details, that these people were going to have a level of protection. Now by this time, Eli had grown up and become the high priest of the Israelites. He served God at the tabernacle in Shiloh. Every year he received those who came to celebrate the Passover and feast of unleavened bread. It says in 1 Samuel, so we go to our first scripture in the book of Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 3, it says, year after year this man, Elkanah, son of Jeroham, went up from his town, which was in Ramah, to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. All these locations are between Jerusalem, just slightly to the north of Jerusalem, and Shechem. So they're all along the top of the hill country there. Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah, but only Peninnah had children. To Peninnah and her sons and daughters, Elkanah would give portions of meat from the sacrifice. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 5, it says, but to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. So it sounds familiar, doesn't it? Here we find again, there's another two sisters, one can have children, one can't, and we find that the Lord closed her womb. So he obviously had plans for her because he's setting her apart, and her desire to have a child is going to become part of her makeup and determine what happens to the child when she gives birth. And so Elkanah's love for Hannah provoked jealousy in Peninnah, and she thought nothing of irritating her. Hannah, without children, felt hopeless, and when provoked would begin to weep tears of self-pity and refuse to eat her portion. Her husband, Elkanah, did his best to console her, And in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 8, it says, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? So obviously the husband's trying to console her because she doesn't have children, and he's putting this comparison that he perhaps should mean more than 10 sons. But of course, she has a sister who has children and she doesn't. And so this is the underpinning of this story. This went on for many years, but God had a great plan for Hannah. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 5, it says, Hannah had not been able to have a child for many years, as I mentioned, because the Lord had closed her womb. So she had prayed for a son, and this is the key here. She promised to give him to the Lord, and in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 11, it says, for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. So I might ask the question, what is the name of somebody who doesn't shave their hair in the Bible? Samson's one of them. But what are they?
Levites, aren't they?
They're not Levites. No. We're going to come to this when we come to the time of the Temple of Jerusalem, when it's all built. You'll see that there's a section in the women's court as you pass through, which is where all these people, all these men will come before they start to ritually cleanse themselves, before they start to re-enter into society, where they actually start to cut their hair once again. And so we find here that this is one of them that's coming, and Samson is actually another one. So I'll reveal the story as we go along, but just think on that, because this is a activity that happens when someone sets themselves apart for God. One of the things that they do is that they don't cut their hair. So going with a husband to Shiloh every year to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty, the priest Eli had observed her praying and blessed her, saying in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 17, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. In the course of time, she did conceive and give birth to a son. She named him Samuel. So this is the story of Samuel. He was born in 1132 BC, the same year that Jephthah died. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 23, it says, so the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she weaned him. 3 years passed in Ramah while Hannah breastfed her son. In 1130 BC, she went to Shiloh for the next annual sacrifice and brought her son and went to Eli. She said in verses 26 to 28, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord, for his whole life will be given over to the Lord. Hannah fulfilled her promise to the Lord and gave her son to Eli. So here's this woman who was desperately wanting her own son, and the Lord had said that he'd closed her womb. And so she prayed and petitioned the Lord and dedicated her son. She said if she was able to have a child, she would give him and dedicate him to the Lord. And so now she finally has a son. What does she do? She actually hands her son over to the priesthood, dedicates his life to the Lord. So going back to Judges, because we've got this two stories happening here, and this is the could say difficulty, but the complexity of the Bible at this point in time. It says in Judges 12 verses 8 to 10, after him, and we're talking about Jephthah, Ibzan, Ibzan, of Bethlehem led Israel. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters. He gave his daughters away in marriage to those outside his clan, and for his sons he brought in 30 young women as wives from outside his clan. Ibzan led Israel 7 years, then Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem. And so we find out at this point in time, when one judge passed and Samuel was born, a new judge took over, and he was Ibzan, and he was from Bethlehem, which of course is where Jesse lives. So we connect him in that story because he's living in the same town as the leader of Israel is living at this point in time. So the prosperity, remember this is a time of peace now. They had Jephthah, and now they have Ibzan. So they have one after another. So prosperity grew under the leadership of Ibzan. You can imagine the leader of Israel being in Bethlehem itself. It would have been good for the town. Can you imagine? It's like tourism today. You know, if he's in town, all the people come to him to solve all of their disputes, to come and see the judge, to get resolution. And so this town would have been bustling because people would have been coming from other places all the time. They would have been eating, they would have been seeking accommodation and all the rest of it. And so you can picture that this would have been a prosperous time for those who lived there. He was elderly, for he fathered 30 sons and 30 daughters. Imagine the parents would have been pretty tired as well. It was not unusual for large families to be born, however. Jesse couldn't help but notice how busy the town of Bethlehem had become, because people from all over Israel came to Ibzan with their disputes, and each other resolved using the laws given by God, because that's one of the functions of the judges. Remember back to the time of Moses when he couldn't cope, and his father-in-law Jethro said to him, "You need help." And so they set up judges, and the judges were of different numbers of people. And so this is where a leader was actually a judge, and this is where that term comes from the book of Judges in the Bible. So Ibzan was old and wise. He obviously loved the Lord. The Lord picked him because he was righteous, and he represented the Lord's will to the people. Jesse, like many other Ephrathites, grew more and more wealthy, selling his produce to the visitors for 7 years, until in the year 1126 BC, Ibzan was gathered to his people. He passed away. In Judges chapter 12 verse 11 it then says, after him Elon the Zebulunite led Israel for 10 years. So Zebulun is one of the tribes which is settled in between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So they're in the Jezreel Valley. And so we've gone from one judge who's further south next to the Dead Sea, and now we're all the way up towards the top. And so what we hear though significantly is we've had one judge, two judges, now three judges with no foreign rulers. So they're having this extended time of peace at this point in time. So going back now to Eli, the priest at Shiloh, as a faithful man of God, but his sons were called Hophni and Phinehas. And they were priests, but they were wicked, and they had no regard for the Lord. They treated offerings brought by the people of Israel with contempt, and they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of the meeting. In 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 17, it says, the sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight. Eli rebuked them, but he did not stop them. His sons did not listen to him, and in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 25 it says, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And so here we have Eli, the high priest of the land, and his two sons who were going to be put to death by the Lord because they were so wicked. And so we see here that the legacy, meaning that the generations that pass their role from one to the next, this is going to come to an abrupt halt here because the two sons had passed away, or not passed away, they've been put to death. So during this time, under the watchful eye of Eli, the Bible tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 18 that Samuel ministered before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod, which is the woven girdle that they would wear. As Samuel, it says in verse 26, continued to grow in stature and in favour with the Lord and with men, his mother, who would travel to Shiloh each year from their home in Ramah for the annual sacrifice, would make him a little robe. So a sacrificial garment to wear with his ephod to give him dignity and honour, to replace the previous as he grew up in the presence of the Lord. So you can imagine he's this little boy priest, if you will, and he's little, and as he grows, his mother comes up every year for the annual sacrifice, and she makes a new garment for him to wear, so it keeps getting bigger and bigger as he grows. And so you can imagine the honour that he was being given as a little boy, that because he revered the Lord and he actually fulfilled what the Lord required of his life, remember he was set apart unto the Lord, his mother would show her love by forming these new garments for him to wear. So this was a special time for Samuel. For as much as he loved the Lord, he'd obviously missed his parents as he grew up as well. One day a man of God came to visit Eli, and he prophesied that God's earlier promise to him that his descendants will minister in his house forever would be cut short because of his son's wicked ways and Eli's failure to correct them. The prophet went on to tell Eli that both his sons would die on the same day. He also told Eli that God would raise up a faithful priest, and in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 35 he says, "Who will do according to what is in my heart and mind?" And so we find that little Samuel is going to do what's in the heart and the mind of the Lord. That priest, as I said, was the boy called Samuel, a boy who had been set apart and brought to Eli. A boy who now wore a linen ephod and ministered, a boy who would grow in stature and favour, both with the Lord and men. Has anyone looked up yet what a person who doesn't cut their hair and are set apart for the Lord are called? I still haven't mentioned, so hopefully by the time we get to the end of the night, there's anyone on Facebook, would they like to see if they can answer that question as well? So what's the name of somebody who doesn't cut their hair anymore and they're set apart? Samson's another one who we haven't quite got to. He's soon to come in the story.
Jesus.
Jesus. No. I'll leave that with you. You can look up your devices or whatever you like.
So what is the name of somebody?
While I continue on.
So what is the name of somebody that doesn't cut their hair?
Yep. So Samuel continued to grow as he ministered before the Lord under Eli. In 1119 BC, Samuel was halfway through his 12th year. Although still a boy, he had been taught the laws of God under the careful tutelage of Eli, and legally he was now considered an adult under the laws of God. Although Elon the Zebulonite led Israel in those days, the people of Israel still did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and many of them intermarried with people of foreign nations and worshipped foreign gods. In 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 1, it says, "In those days the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions." So in other words, no, God's not talking to those people at this point in time. So Eli had become given to sitting on a chair by the tent of meeting during the day as he grew older. Whenever the people of Israel who were still loyal to the Lord came to Shiloh to make the sacrifice, Eli's servant would bring him a portion of boiled meat. And the Bible tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 13, on a 3-pronged fork. Sitting down all day, the portions of meat he enjoyed caused him to become heavy. So you can picture this man sitting on his seat out the front of the tent, the sacrifices are rolling and they're being cooked, and basically he's got his little 3-pronged fork and he's just constantly sampling the cooking all day. And so the Bible tells us that he gets bigger and bigger. And he says also that his eyes had also become so weak that he could barely see. So one night when Eli lay down in his usual place, Samuel was lying down in the tabernacle next to the Ark of the Covenant. He was waiting for the lamp to go out, and while he was waiting, the Lord called him, and he answered. And in 1 Samuel 3, verse 5, he said, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli. He said to Eli, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Samuel did as he was told, but no sooner had he laid down when he was called again. He again went to Eli to be told he had not called and to go back and lie down again. In 1 Samuel 3:7, it says, "Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him." When this happened a third time, Eli realized that it was the Lord that was calling Samuel. He instructed him to go back and lie down. But this time, if he heard from the Lord again, he told Samuel to say in verse 9 of 1 Samuel chapter 3, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." This time the Lord came and stood near Samuel and called him, saying in verse 10, "Samuel, Samuel." So Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." This marked a significant shift. Since the time Joshua, son of Nun, led the Israelites into the land they now inhabited, the Lord had raised up leaders, but he had not spoken with them audibly. To ask for guidance from the Lord, the leaders had to seek a high priest who carried the Urim and the Thummim stones inside their breastpiece and ask the question. The high priest would enter into the presence of the Lord and give them the Lord's answer from the Urim and Thummim stones placed next to his heart. And so we see again a significant shift. Samuel was being set apart. God was going to speak to him directly, different to those who had come before him. Again, the high priest had the pocket, the pouch in the breastplate, and so that's how they normally would receive an answer from God. So the Lord told Samuel that the sin of Eli's family would be judged. And in Samuel verse 14 of chapter 3, it says, "And the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." And so there's a damnation here, because it says, it will never be atoned for. So Samuel was afraid to tell Eli what had been said and went back to sleep for the night. Waking in the morning, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, but was still frightened to reveal to Eli what had been said. When Eli asked Samuel what the Lord had said, he told him not to hide the truth. Samuel spoke, and as he revealed the Lord's message, Eli remembered the words of the prophet. And in 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 13 says, "For I told him," meaning Eli, "that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them." So Eli is being held to account here by the Lord because he failed to be the father he was required to his sons. He was actually bringing up his sons to be servants of the Lord, and they obviously failed him. So Samuel learnt at that moment not to withhold or waste any of the words that God spoke to him when he told Eli everything. And in 1 Samuel chapter 3 verses 19 through to chapter 4 verse 1, it reads, "The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan," which is right at the top of the north, "down to Beersheba," so the bottom of the south, "recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word, and Samuel's word came to all of Israel." So we see a significant shift happen. Because the Lord was speaking to Samuel, the whole of Israel was listening again. For a period of time they'd been fragmented, but once again they'd come back together because of the word of the Lord that came through Samuel. Now when we go back to the book of Judges again, so as you can see I'm flipping back and forth between Judges and the book of Samuel, because there's two stories going on, two sets of events going on at the same time. And this is why when we read our Bible, if we just read it one thing after another, but don't understand it all together, we miss a bit of the picture of what's going on. So it says in Judges 12, verse 12, "Then Elon died and was buried in Ajalon in the land of Zebulun," so again up north. It was now 1117 BC, and it says in Judges chapter 12 again, verses 13 to 15, "After him, Abdon son of Hillel from Pirathon led Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys, and he led Israel for 8 years." So once again, we've got another time of peace with a leader. Then Abdon, son of Hillel, died and was buried at Pirathon in Ephraim in the hill country of the Amalekites. Again, I'm going to put up a map to show you where all these places and Judges are in a moment. There's only a short account of these three judges of Israel. Their accounts, whilst only small in the Holy Bible, say a lot. The most peaceful and happy periods of time, with the fewest remarkable events, have the least to record. So in other words, if you read the book of Judges this time, there's not much going on. It would be pretty boring to read on its own, but at the same time we've got the story of Eli and Samuel going on, which is much more interesting perhaps. But the fact that that was actually happening was because these judges were ruling, and it was actually a time of peace. So we find that very little said, and that's often the case, isn't it? When times are good, we don't hear anything. When times are bad, we hear everything. We've got that at the moment on the news with the COVID-19 around the world. So their accounts, as I said, were small. Much like we say today, no news is good news. The prosperity and peace when Ibzan and Abdon were judges can simply be measured by the prolific number of children they fathered. Remember, one had 30 sons and 30 daughters. This one had 40 sons and 30 grandsons. So they were doing their part to repopulate the land of Israel. So we arrive now in 1110 BC when Abdon was gathered to his people. So the years are marching by. So he's passed away. Now 47 years old, so you may remember we started off with Jesse being born at the beginning of this period. Jesse fathered numerous children. Although his last child, David, is not yet born, he did father a total of 8 sons and 2 daughters. There's references for that if you want to read them, and they're 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 9 to 11, again in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 12 to 13, and again in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 13 to 16. So they're all small genealogical statements. So although there's no information given concerning when they were born, it's reasonable to assume by now that Jesse is married and has fathered one or more of his children. It is also reasonable to assume that due to Jesse's late age when David is born, that he married more than one wife throughout his lifetime. And we find that with other characters in the Bible. Abraham is one example of that. So although the Israelites have been led by their own judges free from foreign rule now for 31 years, the Bible tells us in Judges 13 verse 1 that they again did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. So this declaration that the Israelites were delivered into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years had vast implications. The unrelenting loss of faith that continued to recur throughout the period of Judges since the Israelites first went out into the land of Canaan saw the once unified Israelite nation of confederated tribes continue to disintegrate. Almost no more than a loose group of city-states coexisting side by side. A chain of events will occur that will see Israel forced to enter into a new phase, that of an earthly kingdom with a king to rule over them. And so we come through this period of time of Judges where we see that they were disintegrated, often separated, and even fighting and killing one another. And we arrive at this point in time now where the Philistines are going to rule over them for 40 years, and it's going to lead up to a complete change because we see this cycle where there was sin followed by punishment, and a new leader will be raised up and they would be restored and back into relationship with their father. And then what would happen is it would happen again and again and again. And so we come to this point in time just before the books of Kings in the Bible. So biblically, this enters into a difficult period of history to follow because it straddles both the book of Judges and the first book of Samuel, as we've been looking at tonight, whose chronology is separated and yet associated with the same period. Again, reiterating that the Holy Bible tells us the Israelites were delivered into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years, helps us to pull all this together. This occurs after the leader, or judge Abdon, had been gathered to his people, but before Samuel the prophet becomes leader of Israel and overcomes the Philistines, which we'll get to in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 2 to 13. So I'm going to ask you one last time, has anyone come up with the name for a person who doesn't cut their hair, who's been dedicated to God?
I
Yes?
know, but Tim.
No.
You don't know?
I didn't look it up.
No?
Yeah.
Nazarite.
Nazarite. Right. They're Nazarites.
Mm.
Okay. And so we find that Samuel is a Nazarite. So picture the little boy. Doesn't cut his hair. He grows up, his mother makes him his robes, and his hair just continues to grow. So he would have been quite a character and quite a sight, because he would have stood out amongst everybody
I
else.
was trying to do with Sevi when you guys
My wife's saying that she was trying to do the same with my son, but he wanted to have his haircut. So we find here, I'm just going to highlight this map before I conclude, and I will pass this around, and we will again put this onto YouTube. This is a map of all the different tribes assembled in what was the land of Canaan, but now the land of Israel. And on this map, I've placed all of the different judges throughout the book of Judges by number in order, and also by name and by tribe. And you can see from this, when you look at it, they pretty much cover most of the land that's actually occupied by the Israelites. In fact, the only places that don't is actually right up in these very northern regions, but otherwise most of the land has had judges. So what we can sense from that is that we have a king, for example, in a land. They will establish a palace or a fortress, and that will become the centre for where they actually function from. And as each new generation comes through, they'll take over and rule from the same location. We find during this period of time, however, that no such thing happened. There was no permanent dwelling built for a leader. They would just lead from wherever they lived, because their role as a leader was actually to be a judge, and a judge was actually a person who would administer the laws of God. Okay, it wasn't about collecting money, it wasn't about building armies, it was just ensuring that between these people that you would have somebody who would administer God's laws and solve disputes between the people. And so this is what was going on during that period of time. So just holding out for Facebook that picture with all of those different locations to get an idea. And again, this we put onto the YouTube video later on. So the stories of Samson, now I'm going to call him the Nazarite since we've come up with a name. The story of Samson the Nazarite, Eli the priest, and Samuel the prophet, they all occur during the same period. For all of the Israelites suffering under a foreign nation, the Bible tells us, is only at the hands of the Philistines. And because the Bible tells us that they're going to be delivered into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years, because the Bible gives us these stories across two different books, we can see that they actually all occur simultaneously. We know that Samuel was a younger boy. We know that Eli was an older man. And when we get to the story of Samson, we find that he's a younger man. And we find out that both Samson and Samuel would rule for a period of 20 years each. And so if we do the maths, we've got 40 years of Philistine rule, and their leaders, and they would contest the Philistines, it wasn't all sit back and take it, would occur all in this same period of time. So when you're reading your Bible, it tells us that we can't read these as separate stories, which is how they're normally presented. They actually occur during the same time. These people are all living at the same time in different parts of the land of Israel under different circumstances. And so when we look at that, what does that tell us? It tells us God's hand is on these people. There's a plan already in place because there's numerous things going on at the same time. Okay, so God's making them suffer under this punishment at this point in time, but there's leaders, more than one leader being lifted up at the same time, but these leaders are different to those before because they're set apart for God's purposes only. And so the two leaders that are going to come, again, that's Samuel and Samson, both Nazarites. Both during the period of time of the Philistines, both would rule for 20 years during a 40-year period of Philistine rule in the Bible. So when we knit this information together, it stops us seeing the different books of the Bible with a border between them. Okay, so So this period illustrates the separation of the Israelite tribes from one another and precursors the coming of an Israelite king. For throughout the last few chapters in the book of Judges, if you read it, you'll notice that it says numerous times, Israel had no king. This is the first time in the Bible this happens. So leading up to an event that's going to happen, there's talk of it. And that's because they didn't have a king, and they were being raided and conquered by kings all the time with their armies. And so living in the land, having kings come against them, they start thinking, well, why don't we have a king? Anyone want to hazard a guess why they didn't have a king?
Because they have the Almighty.
Right, because they have the Almighty King, God our Father in heaven. And God didn't set them up to need an earthly king. He set them up to obey His laws, and He would protect them. The problem is they kept walking away from Him. They kept abandoning Him. They kept worshipping foreign gods, and so He let these things happen to them. And so we find now that they start calling for an earthly king. So again, the scriptures actually say Israel had no king. They're all in the book of Judges. I've got 4 references for you. The first one is chapter 17, verse 6. So Judges chapter 17, verse 6. The second one is Judges chapter 18, verse 1. The third one, chapter 19, verse 1. And the fourth one, chapter 21, verse 25. So we see, just by where they're placed in the book of the Judges, it's in the latter period of time. So it's as it's getting close. So during this time, events not only see the Israelites fight against the Philistines, but against each other. The people of Israel, it says in Judges chapter 20, verse 1, came out as one man against the tribe of Benjamin, because they refused to surrender some men from Gibeah who raped and killed the concubine of a Levite priest. The outcome of this battle even surpassed Jephthah and the Gileadites, who slaughtered the Ephraimites. But just over 40,000 Israelites and 50,000 Benjamites were slain, it says, in Judges chapter 19, verse 21. And so we see here we're now talking about 90,000 men from the tribe of Israel have actually killed each other. The previous time was 42,000. So we're talking about big numbers. And so at this point in time, this happened over the death of one person, a concubine. And so we find these 2 tribes went to war against each other. Ephraim, if you keep looking at the maps, is to the north of Benjamin. So they're actually tribes that have a border of their given territories through the inheritance. A dark stain for God's chosen people. So we're going to wrap up here tonight, because next week we're going to see what happens during the next 40 years when the Philistines subdue the Israelites. And so next week we're going to enter into the time of Samson, and we're going to continue to look at the story of Samuel. And it's a fascinating period of time because there's such strong events in the Bible, but as I said, they're not happening separate to each other, they're actually coexisting at the same time. So next week we're going to have a bit of fun with Samson. He's quite a character. He has red hair, a bit like myself. Mine's not so red anymore, but he has a shock of red hair that's not cut. And he has some pretty brutal stories in the Bible. And I'm going to show you a donkey's jawbone next week, which might sound a bit strange. But when I went to Israel a few years ago, we went to the tell where he came from, and we found a donkey's jawbone tied to an olive tree there, which I brought home. And so I'll be able to show you what it looks like, how big it is. And there's illustrations about the Bible that happen to show it looking exactly the same. And so we're going to have a look at those and what happens. A lot of this stuff goes on in the area just below Bethlehem, so it's very close to where Jesse is living and David's going to grow up. And of course the story of Samson and his sons plays out in this lower part of Israel as well. So thank you for joining me. I just want to say as well, next week we have a screen that's been put up behind me here. These lessons are a little bit complicated because there's lots of places and maps and names, So we're doing this to be able to display these behind me so I can point to them so you can better see them in future. So we're hopeful that next week we'll have that all functioning, and it'll help you to enjoy the lesson to see where these places are. So thank you so much for joining us. Pray you've had a good night. God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you next week.